You don't have to. What are you scared of? Did he do the right thing by apologizing?
I'm not scared of anything, Senator.
Then say yes or no. You can say no.
The laws and the Constitution. In any
so you
particular
agree that there are some orders that can be given by the Commander-in-Chief that would violate the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, thank you for your service. But I reject the premise that President Trump is going to be giving illegal orders.
No, I'm not saying he will. But do you believe there is such a thing as an illegal order? That Joe Biden apologized publicly for those actions. Was he right or wrong to apologize?
Senator, I was there on the ground.
I understand, and I respect that.
I've been there.
But you're about to be the Secretary of Defense. Have you been personally involved in discussions of using the U.S. military active duty inside the United States?
Senator, I'm glad we finally got to the topic of border security equaling national security, because it's been abdicated and ignored for the last 4 years.
That wasn't my question. I'm just asking, have you been involved? You're about to be the Secretary of Defense.
Senator Elissa Slotkin put Pete Hegseth on the spot with one critical question. What happens if President Trump gives an illegal order? She pressed him on deploying active duty troops against Americans, the Constitution, and whether he would actually push back.
So I understand that President Trump has the right to nominate his people. We are going to have policies that we disagree with. All of that, to me, comes very standard. What I think I'm most concerned with is that no president has the right to use the uniformed military in a way that violates the U.S. Constitution and further taints the military as that apolitical institution that we all want, right? And our founders designed the system so that we had posse comitatus, that we weren't going to use active duty military inside the United States and make American citizens potentially scared of their own military. We went through our own experience with that with the British. As the Secretary of Defense, you will be the one man standing in the breach should President Trump give an illegal order, right? I'm not saying he will, but if he does, you are going to be the guy that he calls to implement this order. Do you agree that there are some orders that can be given by the Commander-in-Chief that would violate the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, thank you for your service. But I reject the premise that President Trump is going to be giving illegal orders.
No, I'm not saying he will. But do you believe there is such a thing as an illegal order that Joe Biden or any other president, Donald Trump, could give? Is there anything that a Commander-in-Chief could ask you to do with the uniformed military that would be in violation of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, anybody of any party could give an order that is against the Constitution or against the law.
Right. Okay. Are you saying that you would stand in the breach and push back if you were given an illegal order?
I start by saying I reject the premise that President Trump will be giving
you've done your
any illegal
to him,
orders
but
at all.
This isn't a hypothetical, okay? Your predecessor in a Trump administration, Secretary Esper, was asked and did use uniformed military to clear unarmed protesters. He was given the order to potentially shoot at them. Helos flew low in Washington, D.C. as crowd control. He later apologized publicly for those actions. Was he right or wrong to apologize?
Senator, I was there on the ground.
I understand, and I respect that.
I've been there.
But you're about to be the Secretary of Defense
that was involved in that moment. I
was he right to? So he was
legality and the Constitution.
Sir, was he right or wrong to apologize?
I'm not going to put words in the mouth of Secretary Esper or anybody else.
He said them himself. You don't have to. What are you scared of? Did he do the right thing by apologizing?
I'm not scared of anything, Senator.
Then say yes or no. You can say no.
The laws and the Constitution in any particular
Donald
scenario.
Trump asked for the active duty 82nd Airborne to be deployed during that same time. Secretary Esper has written that he convinced him against that decision. If Donald Trump asked you to use the 82nd Airborne in law enforcement roles in Washington, D.C., would you also convince him otherwise?
I'm not going to get ahead of conversations I would have with the president. However, there are laws and processes inside our Constitution that would be followed.
This issue returned to the spotlight in 2026. Senator Slotkin later pointed back to this exact exchange, noting that Hegseth had been pressed in January 2025 about illegal orders and using the military against Americans. In April 2026, she again questioned him about military deployments inside the United States.
President Trump said in November that he is willing to consider using the active duty military against the, quote, enemy within. Have you been personally involved in discussions of using the U.S. military active duty inside the United States?
Senator, I'm fine. I'm glad we finally got to the topic of border security equaling national security because it's been abdicated and ignored for the last 4 years.
That wasn't my question. I'm just asking, have you been involved? You're about to be the Secretary of Defense, potentially. Have you been involved in discussions about using the active duty military inside the United States?
Senator, I am not yet the Secretary of Defense.
Right. I'm
if
just
confirmed, I would be party to any number of
So you
conversations.
haven't been in any of these
which
conversations?
I would not reveal what I have discussed with the President of the United States.
No, just have you been in conversations? You're going to be in charge of 3 million people, the active duty that I know you care about, I believe you care about. So have you been in conversations about using the active duty in any way, whether it's setting up in detention camps, policing dangerous cities? Have you been involved in any of those conversations?
Certainly, I have been involved in conversations relating to doing things this administration has not, which is secure the southern border and not allow floods of illegals to enter our country through an invasion that threatens the American people. And there are ways in which the military is already playing a role in that, to include 5,000 National Guardsmen from Indiana and Texas who are at the border right now, allowing for border security. So there is plenty of precedent for military members
staff detention
our southern
centers.
border.
Our U.S. military is not trained in law enforcement roles. I think you know that, right? We've seen how that mission is difficult for them in places like Iraq and Afghanistan because that's not the training a uniformed military comes with. Do you support the use of active duty military in supporting detention camps?
In June 2025, the Trump administration federalized California National Guard troops and deployed roughly 700 Marines to Los Angeles during immigration-related unrest. By September, about 4,100 Guard soldiers had been assigned to the operation, along with the Marines. The deployment triggered continued congressional debate over the proper role of the military inside the United States.
Senator, everything we will do would be lawful and under the Constitution, but I recognize that this administration has abdicated its responsibility. President Trump is going to restore order at the border, prevent our enemies from invading, and yes, he has said
Sir, I get your filibustering. I get it.
Part of what happens.
In the spirit of preserving the institution that I think we both care about, legitimately, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I've heard a couple of different things. One, you said you will not change the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is what governs justice system in the military. Yes or no? You said that earlier.
Those are laws, Senator, set by Congress.
Okay, so you will not go to change it. You will not attempt to change it. You also said that JAG officers are potentially people who put their own interests in their own medals and promotions ahead of the troops. Senator Lindsey Graham was a JAG officer for most of his life. Is that what you believe about those who implement our justice system in the U.S. military?
Senator, I was speaking about particular JAG officers I've had to deal with in my military experience,
are you going to get
not
involved?
About a member of the United States Senate.
Are you, as Secretary of Defense, going to get involved in the implementation of the U.S. Military Code of Justice?
Senator, ultimately, it will be a big part of my job to evaluate decisions vis-a-vis the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Yes. Have you seen
fairly.
Is CQ Brown on your list in the Warrior boards to be removed from his position?
Senator, every single senior officer will be reviewed based on meritocracy, standards, lethality, and commitment to lawful orders they will be given.
During 2025 and into 2026, the Trump administration increasingly relied on military forces for domestic missions, particularly in connection with border security and immigration enforcement. Slotkin continued pressing Hegseth on the limits of military involvement inside the country, and in April 2026, she again highlighted his original answers on illegal orders and domestic military deployments. That issue remains especially relevant as the 2026 midterm elections approach. In August 2026, Slotkin again sought assurances from Hegseth and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane that U.S. military forces would not be deployed at polling places or used to seize election materials. The renewed concern centers on the fundamental principle raised in her 2025 questioning. The military is subject to civilian authority, but that authority is still constrained by the Constitution and federal law. Federal law generally restricts the use of federal armed forces for domestic law enforcement absent specific legal authorization. That makes Slotkin's January 2025 questioning particularly significant. Slotkin was not simply asking whether Hegseth personally supported Donald Trump. She was trying to establish what Hegseth would do if the president ever ordered the military to do something unlawful. Her opening was carefully constructed. She emphasized that she accepted Trump's constitutional authority to nominate his officials and acknowledged that Democrats would naturally disagree with Republican policies. Her concern, she said, was different, whether a president could use the uniformed military in a way that violated the Constitution and damaged the military's traditional role as a politically neutral institution. She then went directly to the central question. Could a president issue an illegal order? Hegseth eventually answered yes in general terms. He acknowledged that a president of either political party could issue an order that violated the Constitution or the law. But when Slotkin followed up by asking whether he would actually resist such an order, Hegseth did not give her the simple yes or no answer she wanted. Instead, he repeatedly emphasized that he rejected the premise that President Trump would issue an illegal order. That distinction became the heart of the confrontation. Slotkin was asking about a hypothetical constitutional obligation. Hegseth was answering partly by challenging the assumption behind the hypothetical. And that is why the exchange became so tense. Slotkin brought up the events surrounding the 2020 protests in Washington. She referenced former Defense Secretary Mark Esper's account that Trump wanted active duty forces available, and that Esper had pushed back against certain proposed uses of the military. She then asked whether Hegseth would similarly push back if Trump requested the 82nd Airborne for domestic law enforcement purposes. Hegseth again declined to predict what he would tell the president. His answer was that constitutional laws and processes would be followed. Legally, that answer is important because it did not amount to Hegseth saying that a president has unlimited authority over the military. In fact, he explicitly acknowledged that an order from a president could be unconstitutional or unlawful. But politically, Slotkin was looking for something more concrete, an explicit commitment from the future Defense Secretary that he would personally refuse or oppose an unlawful order. She didn't get that commitment. That became even more significant when Slotkin moved to Trump's comments about potentially using active duty forces against the enemy within. Again, Hegseth redirected the discussion toward border security and national security rather than directly describing whether he had participated in conversations about domestic military deployments. Slotkin repeatedly brought him back to the question. Had he been involved in discussions about using active duty forces inside the United States? Hegseth emphasized that he was not yet secretary and that, if confirmed, he would participate in the administration's decisions. The disagreement, therefore, wasn't simply about whether the military should ever operate domestically. There are circumstances in which federal law permits military involvement inside the United States. The National Guard can also operate under different legal arrangements depending on whether it is under state or federal control. The question is what authority is being used, for what mission, and under what legal framework. That distinction is crucial. Border security, disaster response, and certain national security missions are not automatically equivalent to using active duty soldiers as ordinary domestic police. Slotkin was worried about precisely that boundary. She argued that the military is not trained primarily as a domestic police force. Hegseth responded that everything the administration would do would be lawful and constitutional. That answer sounds reassuring at a general level, but leaves the difficult question unanswered: who decides when a presidential order crosses the constitutional line? That is where the role of the Secretary of Defense becomes extremely important. The Secretary sits between the President as Commander-in-Chief and the military institution responsible for executing lawful orders. If an order is clearly unlawful, military personnel are not simply required to obey it because it came from the President. Hegseth's testimony acknowledged that basic principle. But Slotkin wanted him to demonstrate that he would actually exercise that responsibility if the president were the one giving the order. Her repeated questioning, "Would you stand in the breach?" was therefore less about predicting Trump's behavior and more about testing Hegseth's independence as a potential defense secretary. The exchange also reveals why the posse comitatus issue was so important to her. The basic principle behind the law is that federal armed forces generally should not be turned into a domestic police force without legal authorization. There are exceptions and other statutory authorities, but the underlying concern is that America's military should remain primarily a national defense institution rather than becoming an instrument for routine political or domestic enforcement. That concern has become more relevant with the administration's subsequent use of military personnel for domestic missions. And there's another layer to this confrontation: military neutrality. Slotkin repeatedly emphasized that she did not want the armed forces to become identified with either political party. Her argument was essentially that Democrats and Republicans may disagree over policy, but both sides have an interest in preserving a military that Americans trust regardless of who occupies the White House. That is arguably the strongest part of her questioning. A president elected by the people has enormous authority over national security. But the military's legitimacy depends on the perception that soldiers follow the Constitution and lawful civilian authority, not a political personality. Hegseth, meanwhile, was clearly unwilling to concede Slotkin's broader premise that Trump posed a realistic threat of issuing unlawful orders. He repeatedly returned to the argument that Trump should be presumed to act lawfully and that constitutional processes would govern any future decision. That made the exchange politically effective for both sides. For Slotkin, Hegseth's refusal to give a direct commitment created a powerful line of attack. What happens when the president and the Constitution appear to point in different directions? For Hegseth, giving a blanket promise about hypothetical future presidential conversations could itself be irresponsible. A defense secretary cannot publicly disclose every future operational decision or pre-commit himself to a specific response without knowing the facts and circumstances. So there is a legitimate argument on both sides.